Good morning from Nairobi, Kenya. I hope you are doing well. I don't know what the time is in your time zone right now, but we want to wish you a good morning and hope that it's as sunny as it is in Nairobi right now. My name is Linda Ponyo. I am the CEO at the Lawyers Hub, and we want to invite you to this session as we talk about community networks and how to upskill lawyers and the legal fraternity in this particular topic. We want to thank APC for the LockNet project for the support that they have given us in our work on community networks, and we hope that today that this will be useful for you even in the work that you do, both in policy and in the tech ecosystem as well. And so at this point, I would love to introduce my panelists as we lay a background on what community networks are. I would just want them to introduce themselves and say what they do in the space, and then be able to transition to my colleague, Rispa. I will begin first by introducing myself formally. My name is Linda Bonyo. I am the CEO at the Lawyers Hub. The Lawyers Hub works in the intersection between law and technology. We work on digital policy as well as justice innovation. Our work on digital policy has covered different issues, including data protection, artificial intelligence and ethics. We convene the Africa Law Tech Festival. That's an annual event that brings together different players on digital policy within the continent. We've had 2 editions of it, supported by Media Foundation, APC, Mozilla, amongst other partners. We also run the Africa Law Tech Accelerator, where we support startups within the technology space to be able to, raise more funding and grow the digital economy. We also run the Africa Digital Policy Institute, and through that we are teaching different people around digital policy and how they can be involved in innovative policy making processes. So enough about the Lawyers Hub. I would want to begin with my senior, Stephen Kiptines, who will introduce himself, and then we'll go to Jasmine, who will also introduce herself, and hopefully we'll then have our colleague who has dropped off. I hope that she'll be back. So let's begin with Stephen Kiptines.
Right, thank you very much, Linda, for the opportunity. Always a pleasure to come and join you and try to tap off your dazzling star power in this space and try to revitalize my old and tired, weary self who still purports to be a technology lawyer. So I do practice and I teach the law. I think that's just about what's important for our attendees to know. I do have an interest and reading a lot, doing a couple of bits of research around the intersection of technology and the law. So something that's very exciting. So it's a pleasure to be here this morning.
Thank you very much. You are like the godfathers of this specific, domain in the law. I'm really curious about, your view on, the tech side and the legal side. Do you think that that's coming together now more compared to when you first began? What's your assessment of, where you were when you began and now as we begin?
Right, I have quite a lot to say about that. And I was under the impression this was just introduction, but okay, I guess we'll just jump right into it. Clearly, there's a whole lot of space between tech in the last 10 years, tech in the last 15 years. I mean, I've been at practice coming on to 2 decades now, and there's a whole lot of difference just in terms of the flavor of the practice, the availability of opportunities to delve into tech and the law, both from a client perspective, but even from a practitioner's perspective. There's a whole lot of individuals who are doing different things in tech, in the legal profession. And I think there's way more opportunities to combine, whether you are a techie who wants to get to dabble with areas of law and policy, or you're a lawyer who wants to dabble in areas of tech policy, or you're a policy maker who wants to understand bits and pieces. Some of the people I've had the privilege of teaching at the university have no interest in practice as such, but in having a legal understanding about law and policy, which they're able to use in the space of technology. So there's a lot more that's happening. There's way more opportunities for individuals to practice in this area, and community networks is just one of those spaces where there's great opportunities. Obviously, we've been trying to push the boundary here in terms of the regulatory space in terms of the remit of the regulator, in terms of encouraging community networks to grow and invest. And there's a lot of interest for investment in this area, but clearly there'll be a need for lawyers and people who can help support initiatives in that area. It's certainly one of the things that I do in the practice that I have. There are various community networks that we support from one or two perspectives, but what has been a huge pressure point as far as community networks are concerned are the policy angles, are the regulatory angles, are the licensing angles. How do we get them to get a leg up so that these community networks can add value, because they have very direct value they add to the areas that they operate in, to the communities that they serve, and therefore trying to get the government agencies and the government itself to look at community networks as one of the channels, one of the areas that they can enable through having different, for example, having certain discounts on pricing, having certain easier licenses to get, having licenses with less stringent conditions, because these are not entities that get into the commercial space with a purely profit incentive, but rather a more enabling perspective. And so these need to be given the sort of leg up that, you know, NGOs in this country have been given. So there's a lot that is happening in this space, and it's one of the many areas that I certainly am happy to play in.
Thanks for laying that background. I think that's really, really interesting. And for those who are not in the legal sector to know that they're very welcome in this particular discussion, because I think it really takes a sectoral approach for us to get solutions to this specific problem. So I would want to introduce our second panelist, who's Jasmine. She'll introduce herself and let us know what she does in the space and give us a bit more context about the work that she does as well. Welcome, Jasmine.
Thank you, Linda, and also thank you, Kiptines, for the background. As Linda mentioned, I'm Jasmine Miliza. I work for the Association of Progressive Communications Local Access Networks project, and hosted by Kiptanet. It's a project that started in 2018 with research, and then continued into 2019, supporting community networks or community-based initiatives to be able to start and also to scale. So we look at it from end to end, scoping out the ecosystem and seeing the different aspects that community networks need supporting. A lot of the members of our team are actually people who have worked on the ground with community networks. So from our experience, we sort of understand the challenges that they face. So some, as Kiptines has mentioned, there are issues around policy and regulatory barriers for community networks. In other aspects, is issue around funding or capacity. So the project itself, we have different sections. There's part of the project that focuses on the grant support for different organizations, not just as we grow. We realize that it's not just people who are working in community network space, but also other ecosystem enablers such as Kiptanet and Lawyers Tech Hub. And then there's now the aspect where we just look at building capacity for the community networks themselves, and then also trying to influence the policy and regulatory sector so that we can be able to see sustained growth of this movement.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jasmine. And we really appreciate the support of APC in helping us through this work on community networks. Finally, but not least, I would want to introduce Zambi, who will introduce herself, give us a bit more context about her work in this specific field. Zambi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Linda. So my name is Zambi Kakusu. I'm a Tech Policy and Community Networks Associate at Kenya ICT Action Network. So Kenya ICT Action Network is a multi-stakeholder think tank for people and institutions interested and involved in ICT policy and regulations. So I've been working very closely with Josephine on the LockNet project, which is an initiative that is aimed to directly support the work of community networks and contribute to the ecosystem for emergence and growth of community-based connectivity. I'm so delighted to be here. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Zambi, and welcome. At this point, I would want to introduce my colleague Rispa, who will take us through the nitty-gritties. Maybe you're joining this and are wondering, you have questions about, what's community network, what are the policy challenges, and what exactly could we do as a sector. I'm grateful for, CPESA for putting this event together because the diversity of the attendees is really, really important to help us move to the next level in terms of having community networks across, the continent. We'll begin by a few, numbers on what community networks look like, what it is, so that if you are sort of interacting with this information for the first time, then you feel at home. Don't be worried. We're going to bring you up to speed, and then we can go into the flesh of what could happen, what are the solutions that we could have in getting community networks across the African continent. We'll borrow a lot from the work that is happening in Kenya, and we hope that it will be useful for the country that you come from, and that you'll be able to do even better or borrow some good learnings from Kenya. And so at this point, I would want to introduce our digital economy lead, Rispa Rachel Onyango, who will be taking us through a presentation for us to understand exactly what this is. So Rispa, you can say hi and then continue to make your presentation.
Thank you very much, Linda, and good morning to all of us. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. So I just have a brief presentation with regard to community networks. I hope you can see my screen. And so to just kick us off, I think we have seen that Kenya is ranked quite highly as far as mobile penetration is concerned. And I think even should be sometime this week, the CA put up a report showing that we are currently at about 132% mobile penetration in the country, insofar as people who just have access to devices and the networks are concerned. But however, we also have the issue where we have folks in the rural areas who still have no visibility, who still are not connected. And I think this is where the debate and the conversation around community networks come in. And so it has been defined as being a bottom-up approach. Let me just minimize this just a minute. I hope you guys are able to see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Just trying to get it post perfect. So it has been defined to be a bottom-up approach where it tries to meet the needs of community connectivity such that it meets people at their point of need. And so it works insofar as it connects a single server to internet access. And then from this, multiple computers are able to connect. And then we have instances where they're not necessarily connected to the Wi-Fi, but they have access to content. I think this is going to be further illustrated by Jasmine, who has dealt with TunaPandaNet, and so she's going to give us more insights as to how that work has been done. And so what community networks do is that they step away from the traditional basis of commercial operators, and which tend to be expensive and unaffordable for most people in these rural and marginalized areas. And so in Kenya, for instance, we have had the work being done around having a draft licensing and shared spectrum framework for community networks. And I think I'm going to be tagging at my senior Kiptines, who's going to run us through how the work that the CA did in just coming up with this law. And so now looking at the structure of community networks, it's different from the conventional way. So what it tends to do, it leverages on trying to pool resources whereby the community is working together to try and ensure that they're all connected and they're all visible. And so this is the kind of infrastructure that comes into play. So you can see that there is the common pool resource where service providers are working together and the community is being served as well, as compared to the traditional sense, or rather the conventional sense, where there is the structures as far as infrastructure is concerned, and also the network service provider. And so what this does is that there's a lot of crowdfunding, and then there's also a lot of low-cost equipment, and it is easy to deploy. This is because it's leveraging on numbers, and it's leveraging on the ability of the community to come together and try and promote this kind of network. And then the other thing is that it's sustainable. And then since it's reducing on the revenue as opposed to the expenditure that is put in, it's again very beneficial for these communities. And then the tools again are developed by the members of the community networks. This is because they try to look at their needs and then match that to the kind of adaptations that they're going to have to suit the specific needs. And so this is the kind of structure you're going to be finding around community networks. And so as I had mentioned earlier, we had the Tunapenda Net as one of the first examples of community networks in Kenya. I let Jasmine do justice to this, but you can see that one of the things that it did is that it brought relevance to the community. It is low cost and it is very easily adaptable to the targeted communities. In trying to put this up, they had to be able to engage the community to find their needs. Tunapenda Net tried to focus on mainly educational content. And so what it did, it tried to harmonize and bring together the youth especially, such that they have access to this content and be able to kind of grow their capacities within the community. And so that's one of the aspects, that's one of the needs that it sought to cure in the Kibra community. However, there are still challenges that are being faced even in trying to put up this framework. And so one of the key challenges is trying to forge partnerships, bringing people on board to kind of promote this kind of situation. And then there is also no connectivity of electricity in many rural areas. I think this is still a challenge across African states. And then, so the fact that they have to use alternative sources of power, such as solar, which again, are still currently very expensive in most of these regions, is definitely a challenge for them. There's the lack of skill set and also the lack of funding. And so despite that immense kind of potential, it's still up and coming. And I think we're going to have further discussions on this through our panelists. It's still up and coming and people are still trying to get it pushed further, because as it stands, we have just about 37 community initiatives across Africa and across the 12 African states. And so with that, I think I'm going to now push it to our panelists. I think Senior Kiptines had mentioned the fact that he's engaged in community network initiatives, a couple of them. So maybe Kiptines, you could take us through the kind of engagement you have, especially from a legal practitioner's standpoint, and what that has looked like.
Okay. Now, as a background into looking at community networks and understanding them, it's important to note that it stems from a place of providing access. In fact, it goes back to the whole question of universal access or universal service, depending on what the connectivity in a particular country looks like. But clearly, the twin challenges that different emerging economies would have faced or are facing would be with regard to access or universal service. And so, as much as most regulatory agencies would have an initiative in law, in regulation, to ensure that there is connectivity that is sent into those unserved and underserved areas, it is insufficient. And one of the prime examples is our country. So the CA has, and the law has provided statutory requirements for universal access. There's a universal service charge that all licensees have to pay. There is 2 tenders thus far that the CA has conducted with a view to trying to provide universal connectivity in different unserved and underserved areas. But that still hasn't provided the kind of depth and spread that we require, which brings the role of community networks into focus, and especially why they must be treated differently. In fact, the approach by the CA to trying to address questions of access and universal service through using commercial networks has not been successful, because a commercial network will be incentivized by looking at what in the long run could I derive as a commercial benefit. And there are arguably very good commercial benefits in the long run, not in the short term. But community networks right from the get-go have an intention which is not commercially founded. Ultimately, yes, a brand can be built which could eventually transition into a commercial engagement. But the very heart of what a community network sets out to do is to help build the community. I think one of the first community networks from a broadcasting perspective in this country was called Mangelete. That was done so many years ago, perhaps 19 years ago. And it was a broadcasting station that was very local, but has created a lot of value. I think even Ghetto Radio started off as a sort of community broadcasting network. And so this community networks challenge in trying to get into that space has been made way more difficult because of regulators not taking a close look to understand what are the uniquenesses, what are the selling points of these community networks. We can't be licensing them like we license your regular telcos, like your regular broadcasting companies, like your regular tower companies. What attention needs to be paid to them? And some of the attention that is required has to do, and Josephine will speak more competently on this, but really some of the attention that is required has to go around licensing, the licensing process. Must a community network go through the whole shebang in order to get a license? And the licensing process is fairly complicated, which brings me to one of the things that we do. To help put together a license application is not a very straightforward process. It has a technical component and it has a commercial business component. But the business component, if looked at from a typical commercial operator perspective, the point will be missed by the regulatory authority. So that business component has to be looked at from the perspective of what the community network is trying to do. And so that's the kind of support that we also do provide in putting together that application, trying to break down to the relevant individuals within the, say, licensing team or the communications authority, why this is different and why this must be looked at slightly distinctly from that of a commercial network. So getting the CA to simplify a licensing process so that if you're going in as a community network, you have a special track that will give you a far better chance of getting that license is so important. Needless to say, aspects of licensing compliance would still be applied to community networks in the same way. They'd still have to comply with the licensing standards that are given to them. But the license itself, even after going through the licensing process, ought to be much more simplified so that we're not having a hugely complicated license again, because this is not a commercial operator. So having a simplified license will enable easier compliance with the licensing thresholds. Of course, if you're a community network, you will look to be using at some point, depending on your model, frequencies. Now, frequencies are perhaps the most expensive asset in this country, and it's an asset which is finite. If it is finite, if it is an asset that is commercially viable, then of course, if I'm the CA, I'd be looking at giving spectrum to the highest bidder. If you're a community network, you're already priced out regardless of how you look at it. Therefore, the CA needs to take an approach at looking at how do we provide some commercial incentives to community networks so that the cost of frequencies is not prohibitive. Again, to use the example of Mangelete, when they set out all those years ago, because there wasn't any policy basis, there wasn't any structure around how it was done, off the top of the head of the leadership of the CA at the time, a decision was made to give a 50% discount. Now, it may not have seemed like much, but at the time it was something that the CA was contributing towards enabling that community broadcaster. So something that is more definitive, that goes much further, because there's a lot more needs. There are way more community networks who are trying to get into different spaces. And you'll find community networks will identify unique areas that they want to invest in and not necessarily compete from a commercial perspective with one another. And so the CA coming up with a structured policy on how to cost the frequencies and make them available would be huge towards enabling those community networks to get into business. So community networks will help address aspects of access, digital access, aspects of affordability, aspects of just availability. One of the big challenges in justice, in the access to justice, is that we have virtual courts today, which is leaving out a very key contributor towards the justice system, which is the public. The public is, the courts generally are open to members of the public because justice must be seen to be done when you're tried by your peers, when the community can see that justice is being delivered in a courtroom, but because courts have gone virtual, most people, even witnesses, struggle to get in on there. So one of the things that could happen would be to have a community network providing some good, affordable access. It could be a cyber cafe in a rural area where you have paralegals who are able to help people who want to, I mean, there could be a high school student who wants to know what the law practice is about. It could be a case of public notoriety that needs to be followed from different parts of the country. So being able to come into that cyber cafe, watch the court proceedings going on is fundamental towards ensuring that people in that community feel, yeah, justice is being done. We can see what the court process is about. It could also be to inspire that primary, that high school student who wants to get out there. And so it's really important that whatever, regardless of the business plan of the community network, there's a viability that it'll bring to that local area. So the support that we tend to give is in sort of breaking down for community networks who seek to get into that space, what it is like to understand the regulatory space, what the CA is looking out for, but also being able to interpret what they're trying to do to the communications authority. So we would have, you know, lots of one-on-one meetings with the communications authority to explain, so this is what the community network is trying to do. And that has been made easier because of the work that Josephine and APC have been doing over the last year to just try and engage the CA. And I have to say the CA has been very receptive towards receiving those proposals as to how to target community networks in a simpler way through the licensing process, through the frequency process. So there is quite a bit that the CA is now doing, which I believe will lead to greater community networks being licensed, a greater number.
Thank you for that. I think before we jump into the regulatory space, I think I'll shoot it over to Zambi to just tell us about the community networks, especially in Kenya. What has been your experience in so far as has been mentioned, especially licensing, the kind of practices that you have seen, probably the challenges experienced, and that just what it's like in interacting with community networks.
Thank you so much, Rispa. So in my experience, I can tell you that community networks operate differently, that mainly depending on the resources available and the problems facing the specific community. So I like to define community networks as a community-owned ISP for the community by the community. So now, an example of the community networks in Kenya is Tunapandanet, which is one of a kind that's situated in the urban areas here in Nairobi, Kibera. And so Tunapandanet is focuses on connecting schools, educational facilities for students to access educational materials with ease and for access of e-learning platforms. So community networks can take different approaches, like an informal commercial enterprise, which is ideally the community selling its connectivity to end users as an addition to an existing business activity. Mostly you'll find that community is under an umbrella organization. So that's mainly because of the challenges of operational licenses. You can also have a community network take an approach of being externally supported. This is either through development organizations providing connectivity as part of the broader activities, or research organizations setting up pilot projects to test the technologies and the institutional models. Another way can be an established community members, which is now, this is like the most common one, where established community members operate the network mainly on cost recovery basis and mainly use their own resources. So they have to figure a way on how to make the community network sustainable and for scalability purposes. Yes, so and a very good example of a community network which utilizes the readily available resources is Bosco, which is in Uganda, which runs fully on solar battery. And so it runs its operations mainly on solar because of the challenges of electricity. It's located in Gulu, which is in Uganda. Yeah, so I think for me, that is what I can say community networks, the approach that community networks tend to take. There's also now a challenge of making communities adopt the network because of challenges of literacy, which now calls for localization of materials and having just language simplified to the common mwananchi who's in the grassroots level. And yeah, I think that's what I'd say to that question.
Thanks, Zambi. And could you maybe clarify what the process entails in trying to come up with these networks? What are some of the structures they have to put in place, or are there licenses currently, or what does it look like?
Let me ask Jasmine to assist me.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Zambi. In terms of the process that it takes to start a community network, of course, being in the telecom space, it's usually a requirement to have a license that you operate on. But the challenge in many African countries, similar to Kenya, is that those licenses do not exist. And so many, I think quite a number of community networks operate, are not yet licensed, but there are provisions or leeways within their operations because of the focus, maybe them being not-for-profit, providing connectivities to schools, and maybe local hospitals that allow them to operate within the current frameworks. But that is the reason why is focused around advocating for licenses that can accommodate community networks. So apart from the licensing aspect, there are also other key factors that we say this is at first and foremost, it's a community network. So it means that the ownership of this network is supposed to be by the community. And so you'd find that it's either started by maybe someone from the community, an organization within a community, or an external person collaborating with local institutions. So for instance, in Kibera, we see Tunapanda is championed by Tunapanda Kibera CBO, which is located within Kibera. In other areas such as Kilifi, we see Dunia Moja by Lamuka Hub, but the champions are from Kilifi. Aheri in Kisumu, also by a local organization, Lanetu Moja, championed by AFCHICS, and together with the Lanetu Moja community. So there's also areas where we are seeing synergies between maybe an external organization working closely with local organizations. And so in terms of the models, they vary. In Kenya, mostly you find that the models are either NGOs or CBOs. But in other countries such as South Africa, as well as Nigeria, we see that they are run by cooperatives. So it really depends with the provisions that are within a particular jurisdiction. And then there's usually very, very strong support from local authority, especially chiefs. We see that in Kibera, in Lanet Umoja, where previously it was the late Chief Kariuki who worked in close collaboration with AFCHICS to champion it. After his passing, the one who succeeded him also continues to carry on that mandate on behalf of the community. similar to Kilifi and Aheri as well. So that's just around the formation on the community, and then we move on now to other aspects as what is really the role of this community network. The first one is usually service provision. They act as a gateway to get people access to services. It can be internet, it can be access to local content such as e-learning content, or as well as e-health content. Other aspects include capacity building. I think Kiptin has brought this up around the holistic, and Zambi as well, around the holistic approach to digital inclusion. We know that the barriers to access, the barriers to digital exclusion or the digital divide, it's not just around access, but they're also beyond access factors, such as literacy levels, such as locally available content. And so community networks also look into this to enable the community not just to be passive consumers of the internet or technologies, but also contributors in that particular ecosystem. Yeah, and then technology-wise, a lot of them gravitate towards Wi-Fi based technologies because, as we know, Wi-Fi is an unlicensed spectrum, and currently that is what is affordable.
And maybe we could look at the policy aspect, probably with regard to the work that the CA has been doing. What is the impact of this draft kind of provisions that we are having coming up? And I think I'll also let Kiptines chime in on this, insofar as the different provisions as concerns licensing, spectrum sharing, and also just the involvement of stakeholders in this ecosystem. What does that look like, and what will be the impact of this regulation?
Yes, sure. I'm happy to tackle that. I think I'd like to start with just why this is very important. A lot of countries are still yet to adopt this model. I think the envisioning of the telecom service provision, it was maybe more towards commercial operators and not for-profit entities. The other aspect is not just about the commercial or not-for-profit operators, but also how licenses are given. So in terms of geographical scope, you find that in Kenya, for example, Tier 1 and Tier 2 cover the national, and then we have Tier 3 that covers a county. In Kenya, we know that a county is still a very large geographical area to cover. So for Tier 3s who are expected maybe to cover a county, there are also limitations because they are still small operators, and so financial aspects that will enable them to scale at that level might be limiting. So this particular license for community networks was very important because it seeks to address these challenges. The first one being recognition of not-for-profit entities to be able to provide telecom services. Also, the coverage, them being able to provide a service. Currently, the draft proposals, the draft proposal is at sub-county geographical level. So I think that is a good way to start. And also, as Kiptin has mentioned, it's also very challenging, especially for grassroots communities, to be able to apply for this license. So the simplification of this license in a way that from just the application process. What we had before is that if you are applying for a license in the current framework, you need to apply for a network facility license and then an application service provider license. What now the draft proposes is that this will be merged into one, resulting just into a single license operation. So that means that if a community network applies for a license, they'll be able to operate the network, and they'll also to be able to offer services under the same. And then there are other issues around affordability of the license. Currently, that is still a major barrier. So the proposal is actually to have to lower the initial and annual fees for community networks so that it's affordable. So we are moving from like the tier 3, which was also quite expensive, to now a proposal of having an initial operating license fee of 5,000 and an annual operating fee of 5,000 as well, and then the application at 1,000. So all this, I think, would be very helpful, just to say, so that in our experience, there are so many other communities that would like to offer, but just this is a major barrier, because you also don't want to invest in infrastructure and then be shut down because you don't have the appropriate licensing. Then, of course, in the spectrum sharing aspect, is just we propose reviewing the framework, especially the fees, so that there can be more service, especially in underserved and rural areas. And this is a challenge that all the operators from the tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 operators brought up, that it's very expensive to provide service in rural areas if we include taxes. Not to mention that in these areas, sometimes there's not, for them, they don't make like a business case. There are also other challenges with supporting infrastructure, such as electricity and roads. So for them to provide affordable service, there's need to review the whole spectrum framework, so that at least there's a difference between if you're connecting rural and underserved areas and more urban areas. Also waiving spectrum fee for community networks and small operators, conducting a review of the international approach to creation of more localized access to IMT spectrum. And this is important because currently what we are seeing is that when you're able to, for licensing for IMT spectrum, is that you get a national coverage, but I think majority of us know that service in Nairobi is very different as you go into the rural areas. So it's important that, for example, if a service provider has a national license and they are not using, for example, in Mandera, they can accommodate another service provider who wants to provide service in that area instead of holding that particular spectrum. Yeah, and then just other issues around and power limits for Wi-Fi equipment, which is mostly what majority of the community networks would gravitate towards as they start because of the pricing.
Okay, Captain, kindly.
I won't add much more. I'll keep this very short. This is the furthest the CA has gone in, almost a lifetime in terms of trying to make very specific provision for community networks. And everybody who's within the community network space is absolutely grateful. Obviously, it would have been preferred if the CA could have gone way further. But it's not to say that we are ungrateful, simply because this is a starting point, and hopefully this will create a viability for several community networks in different parts of the country that allows us to go back to the CA in a year or 2 or 3 and say, look at what the work you did for us has opened up. Now, can we move that? Can we push that envelope a little further? Can we get some of the other things that we didn't get? So there's definitely going to be an impact. And I'm certainly hoping that this will be directly related to the number of community networks who are willing then to invest and go out there. One of the things that Josephine mentioned, which I need to reiterate, is, and this is one of the things that we didn't get that from the CA, is all the juicy spectrum will obviously have gone by this point or is on the way out to the benefit of the commercial operators. So it's not as if any juicy spectrum will be left for community networks to come and pick up. And therefore, the point of having to share with community networks that frequency, which is not being put to full utility, which may not have come round into use, but has been paid for by and allocated to a commercial operator, there needs to be a way that the CA can ask them, can require them rather, to co-share the access to that frequency with a community network, because they are holding on to very prime acreage of spectrum, which would be viable in those unserved and underserved areas. So that's something that I'm hoping can be built up on by the next round of engagement with the CA. And finally, as I understand it, the CA is probably going to go into another phase of opening up a tender for universal service. I'm hoping and expecting that by that time, there may be an increase in the number of community networks who can participate and be enabled to participate in that space, because it involves the CA giving a chunk of money that has been raised as part of the Universal Service Fund to specific entities to roll out in particular areas. That's it for me.
I think you've mentioned two very pertinent issues that I'd like maybe you as panelists to belabor, and that is the issue of the sharing and then the issue of funding mechanisms. So to begin with regard to just the issue of the shared spectrums, as you have mentioned already, these spectrums have already been taken up. And so we still see the issue of the digital divide persisting. We still have so many people who are not connected, who still have no access. So maybe could you probably just tackle the issue of digital divide, digital rights, and also how community networks now can come in and whether it's even viable, because there are people who still have no idea how we can be able to onboard or get them connected. So is it practical at this level? Is there ways to make it better and more beneficial to the communities? Probably you could tackle that first, and then we can look at the issue of just the different funding mechanisms that have been given. I don't know whether we could start with the Kiptines once again, and then we can now go to Josephine and then Zambi.
The statute encourages sharing in principle, but unless something is required explicitly, either by way of a license condition or a regulation, then there'll be no interest for me as a commercial operator to offer up, to come and say to Tunapanda, hey, guess what? I have some extra spectrum here. Or if you know that there's some spectrum being held by this entity, approaching them and having them say, yeah, I'm happy to discuss terms on how you can join us in this in utilizing this spectrum. So this is something that we needed like yesterday, but it is something that is not going to come easy, simply because, again, you have to look at it from the perspective of commercial operators. They'll be saying, no, we have a plan for this. We didn't apply for these frequencies flippantly. We have a plan. Just because our plan is going to take another couple of months or years to implement doesn't mean that we should give it to you, because the truth of what happens is, before, for example, 5G, one of the companies in this country is rolling out 5G and has said, that'll be rolled out to the whole country by sometime next year. Of course, the flip side is 5G phones are also very expensive. How many people will have 5G phones? But by the time they roll out 5G, they will have conducted tests, and tests on 5G networks started a while back. There was a lot of refarming of certain portions of frequency. There was allocation of new frequencies that are exclusive for 5G. So tests do happen. So it is a viable and practical excuse, well, not excuse, but justification that we are using it for tests. So there needs to be a regulatory approach which allows access up to a point which doesn't disenfranchise them, but similarly doesn't disenfranchise those who would like to utilize the frequencies as community networks and don't have access to it because it's already been commercially allocated to someone else. So it is something that is absolutely necessary, but I can see how the CA would want us to build a case for that with the quick wins that we have already gotten at this level. The frequency question is still very much up for discussion. There's still a lot more that the CA could deliver in that space. But for the time being, I think community networks need to take what has been given, work on that in order to create a platform for further engagement with the CA on the question of frequencies.
Josephine, yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Kiptines. I think you've tackled quite the issues around spectrum. So I'd just like to move to issue around rights. And yes, I think definitely in the digital rights, even as most of the time I've seen that we tend to discuss, like privacy rights, but we forget the fundamental aspects, which is which is access. Without access to infrastructure, without access to devices, we will not even be talking about digital rights. And from a communication perspective, yes, internet is actually a human right, because it's access to, it's a platform that we are able to use to express our opinions, access to governance, access to services, access to participation, so access to education. So in a way, it enhances equality, justice, and human dignity. Are community networks viable? Yes, I think we I find that it's commendable that even the fact that they've been able to do this despite the environment, despite the support that the limited support that they have. So if you go to different community networks run by communities trying to get their own resources so that they can be able to deploy the network, to manage the network, building their own capacities to operate the particular network, it's quite commendable, especially given that these are not commercial entities, but just not for profit with a social purpose. So in terms of them being viable from a business perspective, also yes, because they go into these communities, and we understand that in some areas the community is not yet developed, so it's not where it's ready to get access that you deploy today and get users tomorrow. And that is why I would say maybe quite a number of commercial operators fear, because then return on investment will not be that fast. But for community networks, they go in and then they work together with the community to build the digital economy in the particular community, which takes time. But I think the silver lining of the pandemic has been the acceleration towards digital inclusion. So more communities are more aware, or more people are more aware about the importance of being connected, the importance of access. So with the right support, I believe that community networks are viable. They're able to scale. They're able to become sustainable. But the environment really, really matters at the end of the day.
Thank you, Josephine. I think just riding off of that, Zambi, could you probably tell us what has been the impact of COVID-19 as raised by Josephine on community networks, and how that has just impacted the different facets of it?
All right, thank you. So with COVID-19, we saw very many people working remotely, schools were closed, and students needed to sort of access educational materials. So it's very notable across a good number of community networks that more those that connect households were able to connect more people, and more people embraced the online and digital platforms for maybe to conduct for educational to access educational materials, to work, and as well as to promote their businesses. So I'd say community networks and COVID really gave community networks a boost, which is now something that which is very commendable now, despite the fact that a good number of rural areas are not electrified, which gives a challenge to the network and access to internet. I'd say affordable access to communication is also something to look into, because community networks ideally avail affordable internet to the community members. So that is why it's important to also consider localizing the content for the community members to be able to access content without much strain and in their own localized languages. I can say in developing countries, the mobile revolution has really transformed the continent as well. And however, the demand for broadband still grows, and access is penetration is slowly growing. So I'd say now community, I'd say COVID has really given internet access a boost, and the need to bridge the digital divide.
Okay, now if we could just shift gears a bit and consider the gender gap insofar as the stereotypes, the biases are concerned, and how just women can be able to participate in community networks. What insights can you give us on that? I'll pick it up from Jasmine and then probably go to Captainess.
Sure, yes. So in terms of the gender digital divide, I think one of the aspects that come up for community networks is the engagement of women in the digital space. And last year, together with TunapandaNet did a research just to understand the gender digital divide in Kibera, what are the challenges, and the impact on COVID-19. And what we found out is that, which is very similar to other areas, is that there's the issues around access and affordability. So you find that women, especially as some are breadwinners in their houses, when they get their money, their finances, they're less likely to invest that in internet unless they see like a very clear value proposition. So either it's a business that will be able to generate income, but if it's just for like entertainment or the social aspects, they tend just to buy when they're able to afford. Then there's also the issues around awareness and fear of the online space, maybe from other people's, their neighbors or their friends or their family experiences. So the other issues around awareness and building their capacity to be able to come online, participate, but also to be able to protect themselves. So how community networks are able to address this is just, I think, in going to places where women spend their time. So in Kibera, for example, you find there are several what you call women centers where it's either they run a business there, or it's an organization, or it's a place where they come for different socioeconomic benefits. So providing connectivity in these areas, in this center, so that when they come there, they're able to access the internet. Also building their capacity just in terms of the devices that they have. So if they have feature phones, maybe just how to prevent themselves being scammed based on the day-to-day usage. But if they have smartphones and they go online, so basically how to go online, but also how to protect themselves and once they go online. So I find this quite a step forward in terms of bridging this gap, because you actually go to women where women spend their time. Putting a hotspot, I was in Kenyatta Market, one of the places where it has quite a number of women, and it was quite impressive to see there's actually a network there, and they pay like 100 shillings to connect for a whole week, and it's unlimited. So such efforts to go to markets where women spend their time, build their capacity, based on what they have and what they would like to do are some of the steps that I believe community networks are taking in terms of bridging the divide, and also just bringing more women into the space to participate in the telecom space, whether it's deploying the network or it's policy advocacy. Yeah.
Over to Captainess, and I think also if you could also just touch on the technical aspect. I think Jasmine has really raised the issue of the social aspects of it, but there's also the technical insofar as just the infrastructure is concerned, how we can get more women participating in that regard. And also I saw a very technical kind of topic or word with regard to spatial politics and how that affects spectrum regulation and the involvement of women. I couldn't make sense of it just yet. And so maybe I could dish that out to you to maybe give us insight on that.
Rispa, maybe you could not dish that out to me because you forgot, maybe you've not looked at my CV. It has an LLB, not Bachelor of Technology and Engineering, which Josephine has. So
you're a godfather. You're all very capable panelists. I'll dish it out to all of you.
Look, in terms of bridging that digital divide, and Josephine has spoken very competently about how that can be used to bridge that divide, the sex divide, digitally. I know that for sure, if community networks can actually take root in every single community where they see a viable plan of action, then it will clearly lead to an equilibrium of sorts, or perhaps I should say an equity of sorts, not necessarily equality, because there are a few other things which will not lend themselves to equality, but it will create some equitability in terms of accessing that digital platform, which we know is a window to so many other things. If you are in a rural area that is looking at, you're a tea farmer, then there's ways you can use that access as a local farmer who's supplying your half an acre, your acre, your third acre of tea to a tea factory somewhere in the hinterland of the country, to know what's happening with the tea industry. It will make you understand, for example, that today tea prices are completely horrible, but conversely, coffee prices are pretty good. So by next season, I'll be thinking, you know what, I'm going to remove all my tea plants. That'll be the last harvest. I'm going to move into coffee again, depending on so many other things, including whether the soil is viable, the climate, access to the other inputs. But it'll allow them a much broader picture in order to compete at a place that allows them to get justifiable revenue for what they're planting. So it'll create access for children who are in rural schools to have better access to educational facilities. There are many individuals, companies, and even some of my clients who are providing educational material being offered digitally. So it'll not disenfranchise that child who's in a rural area who for most of last year could not access class, but most children from living in major towns and cities could access that kind of education because of digital availability. So it'll provide some equity in the educational perspective. It'll provide some equitability with regard to access to health services. It'll provide equitability to farmers and people who are selling products in order to get an understanding of what the wider world or the wider country is doing. Obviously, there needs to be a more cultivated attempt by government, by policymakers, but also by people in different institutions to encourage technical growth of technical skills with women. A couple of the clients that we have tend to reserve a percentage of the technical jobs of rollout that they do for women. The only problem is, where are these women who have these qualifications? And if it's more at a technician level, then they provide apprenticeships for women who are willing. But one of my clients, a client who came in to invest into this country, one of the challenges they face is that in terms of providing opportunities for apprenticeship for women, they don't have as many takers. And they put this to those women who are in their company. They tell them, go and tell your young girls who are in school who want to get into this space, we're happy to give them training, apprentice them and see whether they can get other opportunities. But by and large, they don't get too many takers. So perhaps there's a deeper problem in certain parts of trying to encourage the women folk and ladies to understand this is not a man's job. This is something that I can get into. It'll give me daily bread, but more than that, it'll provide an open opportunity for me as a woman to grow in that technical space. So I think there's a lot more that goes into the space of the policymakers that is not being done sufficiently. Having said that, I think we're seeing way more women in the technical space today than we've ever seen, but I don't believe those numbers are sufficient as yet.
Zambi, would you like to chime in on the same?
Sorry, I completely agree with Captain. Yeah, we could do better with a huge, bigger number of women taking up technology. Unlike the normal way of letting us as women taking the backseat and letting the men go on matters technology and anything technical.
Okay. I think now just trying to come to the conclusion of this. Josephine, you could probably take us through countries where community networks have already really kind of taken, I wouldn't say taken root, but it's working, such as SA. And I think they're doing a good job. And also probably we could talk about the different incentives that can be offered in trying to promote community networks, especially here in Kenya.
Thank you, Rispa. I think in terms of countries that we can see like progress for community networks, I'd start with just like from organizing at community level. We see quite huge progress in South Africa with Zenzeleni, how the model has evolved from just one cooperative community network to having this umbrella body that supports the seeding of community networks, which is the Zenzeleni NPC, and then having seeded 2 cooperatives already, and working also with the British High Commission in South Africa to also seed another community network in Northern Cape. So I think the success factor is in South Africa is the ability to, not just have a community network serving one community, but growing to a level where you're also able to support the growth of other community networks in the country. So Zenzeleni, it's not just the 3 that it's currently supporting, but also now through APC support, they have done mentorship programs for other community networks since the first iteration happened in 2019, and then the second one now is running from last year going up to 2023. So this will bring together, this is a mentorship program for 7 community networks in South Africa, addressing, I think, major challenge or major barriers that community networks face. And then there's also the aspect around how community networks are responding to the barriers, especially with regards to supporting infrastructure. So we see an example in Uganda, where Bosco Uganda has been able to build a solar power plant that not only just power a network which spans over 400 kilometers, but also powers, I think they power now 2 schools and small businesses. So this is an area that in Gulu, that they don't have access to grid electricity. So we are seeing that, as you're saying, the holistic approach to digital inclusion, but also other aspects of inclusion, such as electricity. And then the last one, so I'm just picking the ones in our different sub-regionals, so South Africa, East Africa, and then in Central Africa, an example being Pamojanet, which is located in EG Island, and also them addressing the digital divide through building the network. And they're actually one of the community networks in Africa that are going beyond just Wi-Fi to look at other aspects such as GSM, because of course in some areas we know that smartphone penetration is not that high, so a lot of the communities still use feature phones. So La Difference is, which is Pamojanet, is one of the community networks that are also looking to address the gap. So the voice gap, not just the data gap. Yes, so at policy front, I would say Uganda is also another country that now has a communal access license, which was passed in 2020. And so the holders of this license are authorized to establish, operate community networks, and it's suitable for community-based organizations and not-for-profit entities. Yeah, so Uganda got it right in terms of just having the communal access license, but the challenge with that is that in terms of affordability, is not, it's still not quite affordable for community networks, for local communities. Zimbabwe, I believe it was this year that the Postal and Telecommunication Regulatory Authority, Zimbabwe, it's called POTRAS in short. They also created now a specific license for community networks, and also this is quite affordable. So they allow for community internet service provision license, and the application fee is set at $50 and renewal is also $50. So these are some of the, I think, just from the aspect of building that community movement bottom-up approach in terms of community ownership, and also addressing the technical challenges, infrastructural challenges, and also policy challenges. Yeah, those are some of the great examples from Africa.
I think you mentioned the issue of not connecting just one, but trying to onboard even more. And it reminded me of the Ubuntu or communal effect that we have in Africa. Are there cases or rather practices outside of Africa that you could borrow from? Or is this really custom made, to feel the nature of our community kind of engagement?
Yes, so I would say, sorry, am I down to take that?
Oh, yes, you can. And then any one of our panelists, we can go to Kittiness thereafter and then Zambi. Okay.
Yes. So in terms of the, there are other models globally. I think even for me, in 2016, during as we were still envisioning TunapandaNet, one of the networks that I learned even before the African ones was GIFINet in Spain. And then as we got into the CN space, of course, interaction with other community networks such as Altamundi, Colnodo, those are all in Latin America. And then there are also other examples in Asia, such as Savalot. Yeah. So there's definitely like some areas that you can be able to borrow from the other countries, especially I think tech-wise, policy-wise, we see some of these countries are way ahead. For example, Argentina currently has a USA fund that is going to fund community networks. There are also technical aspects such as on how to run a community network, how to build the infrastructure that you can be able to share. When it comes to community organizing, I think that is where now really it's just the uniqueness of each communities. Even in Kenya, for example, there are some things that will work in Kibera that will not work for Twahir, for example, in Kilifi, or Barak in Aheri, or Irene in Lanetumoja. So we have built this peer exchange practice in APC through the LockNet project, where we bring together these different community networks from these 3 continents. So they have time to exchange and learn, so that you're not replicating efforts or you're not struggling with something that someone else has already done, but also recognizing that each community at the end of the day is different.
In the words of a great English judge, I have nothing useful to add.
That's good enough. Zambi?
I'd like to say, to reiterate Kiptine's words, that Jasmine has covered a good chunk of everything.
Yeah, I think I have learned a lot in this session. And so I think as a way of just final remarks, probably what could our policy makers look out for, and probably your insights from having interacted in this ecosystem, what could you probably tell us as a closing off remark? So I think we'll start with Stephen. We have had Jasmine on the spot for too long. So we'll start with Stephen and then go to Zambi and then close it off with Jasmine.
Don't ignore community networks. Pay close attention to community networks and enable them. That's what they need. No other favors. Enabling them is really what they need. Of course, if can go further, as the example that was cited by Josephine, where USF in a particular country, like I don't remember the country, is being used to help fund community networks, that's even better. But at a minimum, enable them, from a regulatory perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd say it's important to enable community networks, as Captain has said. Firstly, reducing the cost of access to optical fiber backhaul networks. I think that will be a very good start. But over and above, I think so far so good. If community networks got support from the USF, that would be also a very, very great step to ensure sustainability and smooth running of community networks. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'd like to go back to what Captain said at the beginning, is that this is an area of opportunities, I think across the board. With the building of infrastructure, with the building of community skills, at the end of the day, we recognize that the CNs themselves are not able to do everything. There's need for local content platforms. There's need for the local content itself. So it's also an opportunity areas for people in the ICT space, for people who want to invest in community networks as well. They need investment in terms of infrastructure. And also in the legal sector, it's definitely a growing area, and there's quite room for opportunity. So I think I would say that we shouldn't look at them as competitive, like models coming to replace anyone or any particular operator, but they're just a complementary approach, recognizing that at the end of the day, these are areas that are unserved or underserved. And so community networks are addressing these gaps, and we cannot continue to tell community networks to wait, communities to wait up until there is an operator who feels that they can now connect them, if they're able to start doing it themselves, and then even build room for now maybe commercial operators, for partnership with commercial operators.
Thank you for that. You have mentioned the legal sector, and I just remembered, how can we get lawyers, the legal sector engaged in this space? I am so sorry about this, but Captain, kindly tell us the opportunities that you have in this space, and then we can all go home.
I think it starts with having an interest. I don't know that there's classes where an individual who's in law can go for training in these issues. I mean, there are certain basic core courses which could be done, but the opportunities would start with those lawyers who have an interest in technology. and then finding their niche in different technological aspects. I mean, from the basics of contract drafting and contract review to the more complicated issues around licensing and regulation, which requires a minimum understanding of the relevant statutes and the regulations associated with the licensing process of the Communications Authority, an ability to undertake research of disparate legal regimes in terms of legal and regulatory practice as regards community networks. Then, of course, you do have the opportunity to work almost as an in-house lawyer or work as an external resource for community networks in guiding them around other legal processes, because there will be contracts that will need to be engaged in, whether they're contracts of employment, which brings in aspects of employment law, whether it is contracts with suppliers. Of course, you know, you never pray that you get into litigation, but ultimately that, you know, becomes an area that would be of opportunity in terms of protecting and advising community networks if a situation is threatening to get into litigation. Hopefully it should never get into that, because it's just a waste of time in terms of focus of the community network. But it spans that sort of broad aspect, but it would help if there's already an interest in the space of technology, because then it's an easy hop into the related areas around community networks.
Thank you very much. And Zambi, Jasmine, do you have anything to add, lest I lock you out?
No.
No, thank you. Maybe just to say there's also a need to create awareness. So a good number of people in tech are not aware of community networks. So it will be also a great start to create awareness and capacity building sessions for anyone interested in tech, lawyers and other stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our panelists. You have been amazing. We have learned quite a lot, and thank you for staying on to the call and being able to respond to our different queries on issues, community networks. I think from this, we are going to be able to be better engagers on the topic and be able to facilitate even faster adoption in this regard. And so with that, I think we can close it off. Thank you once again very, very much. And to all our attendees, thank you, and keep on enjoying the rest of the day and the sessions ahead.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Respond.